infinite growth cannot happen on a planet with finite resources.
The concept of the circular economy is out there. It doesn't fit with this current economic model.
This is a question of life and death. Industry and governments and everybody has to get on board.
Today, we're going to talk about money. How does money reveal or conceal intention? And how can money help or hinder climate action? On a scale of 1 to 10, how optimistic are you about our ability to combat the climate crisis?
I think I'm pretty optimistic, so I would say like a 7 to 8, just because I think a lot of the solutions are already out there, and governments and corporations know that people are watching and we are ready to hold them accountable.
The question really is more about, are we willing to take the steps necessary in order to actually get there? I think given the momentum that we've seen in the last few years, I'd say an 8.
Pre-COVID, I would say 3, mainly because everybody was partying like it was 1999. Full carbon expenditure, and then, the pandemic happened. And I think it really just changed the way that we thought about how we lived. I would say now it's 7.5 because I feel that a global behavior change event has occurred. And so everybody is now very cognizant about what the issues are.
I would say 7. It's not around the solutions anymore. It's more about bringing the players together to work together to that final solution.
I'm a 10, and that's mainly because of the people sitting around me, which gives me a lot of hope. So I'm very optimistic about our future.
Since the Paris Agreement, the top largest 60 banks are still collectively investing about 3.8 trillion into fossil fuel. So from your perspective, what do you make of that? How does that fact sit with you?
Fossil fuels aren't going to go away tomorrow. That's a fact. We still need oil because oil is more as a product for petrochemicals, for chemicals, for our everyday needs. Gas is still seen as a transition fuel. It's trying to replace coal. It's cleaner than coal. It's cleaner than burning oil in ships and in aviation. So what we're trying to do is say that oil and gas still has its place. Hopefully one day it will be phased out completely. But right now, technology and zero carbon fuels are just not there to be able to replace it at that scale.
We also must not forget nature is also a technology, right? So for the longest time, the plants among us have been photosynthesizing. They have been accumulating and sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, locking up the carbon in their biomass, in their trunks and leaves and branches. So they are a very important and significant source of carbon storage potential, and also a carbon sink, which means it sucks up all the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So in that sense, I think nature-based solutions in terms of protecting our remaining standing forests and also growing new forests are very important ways for us to address climate change impacts.
One sentence that comes to mind is that infinite growth cannot happen on a planet with finite resources. I really think that there has to be a whole mindset shift in how we think of economy and money in general.
There has been evidence since the 80s of oil and gas being very, very cognizant of the fact that climate change is a huge problem, but there was a lot of climate denial in the industry. What do you think are the steps required to repair that relationship between some of the stakeholders on this issue?
Building trust with the public and building trust with consumers is a very big responsibility for corporations and also financial institutions, certainly. You could probably throw in governments in there also. WWF did a survey recently in Singapore that showed that overwhelming majority of Singaporeans surveyed wanted to choose sustainable. The challenge is in what is sustainable. Is this eco-label actually sustainable or is it not? Is this certification trustworthy or not? But it's also important for consumers to demonstrate and to be vocal to companies that they want sustainability, they want sustainable products, because the companies will also make the necessary changes if they see the demand for it.
Just adding on to that, as somebody who's personally very conscious of the kind of things that I buy or consume, there's a lot of greenwashing that happens. And so you may see like a company claim to be sustainable, but it really takes a lot of deep digging to find out if that is true.
From the financial institution perspective, how can we invest money into companies which we know are trying to reduce their emissions if we don't know what their emissions are? So it's around transparency, it's about data. And we are still in that process of collecting this data because we are still trying to foster this culture of transparency.
When you hear a young person saying, I will only choose to buy an item that I know is sustainable, or let's just not just talk about young people, like, everybody, right? They make a decision that I'm only gonna eat something that is ethically sourced, or, and I want to know what defines ethically sourced or sustainable. Then you're literally seeing the market move. And when the market moves, every company has to move along with it. I don't think it's a conversation anymore to talk about, renewables as something in sustainability. It's almost like, it's business as usual. It's just another product. It's like, another way we get energy. And I think that is powerful because now the market has normalized what that is.
There is a lot of urgency about the climate crisis, but it sometimes seems that, just like we've been sitting around talking about this problem for the last 20, 30 years. And how do we get more ambitious, especially because we know that time is running out, right? We're fast approaching that point where, it will be past the point of no return, so to speak.
When I was 5, we were all facing the ozone layer issue, right? It was the depletion of the ozone layer and, countries had to take collective action to figure out how do we stop this, right? Otherwise, greenhouse effect, we're all gonna cook. And this was a question that I don't think there was any debate over. People, then it was a question of just disseminate down products-wise, and everybody had to follow suit. So the question is, what's changed from 87 to where we are at right now? We need to be responsible. This is a question of life and death. Industry and governments and everybody has to get on board. Okay, so this is what's changed, and this is what's led us to where we are at today, where we have things like climate deniers or flat earthers. We've got the power of information on our phone. We're still having these conversations. So that's what's changed. But that's also the power to change that we have right now to be able to shape that conversation towards the future.
Many things have changed since the protocol that was successful in addressing the ozone layer issue in the 80s. I think we also have to recognize that it was a much simpler issue than climate change. I think with our collective commitment through the Paris Agreement, we have also decided as an international community to address climate change. Maybe that momentum was a little bit slower than it should have been, but I think the acceleration of that momentum since Paris has been quite astonishing, not just from governments or from individuals, but even in the finance sector. There's a general agreement from most of the institutions that climate risk, climate change is an issue for our economic future. And that's something that we didn't really see just a couple of years ago. The social media landscape has changed. The way we communicate has changed. I think that can be a good thing and a challenge. And I think really we need to emphasize the good things, which is that we can amass a collective movement behind this as we couldn't before.
I think many countries and businesses have already started implementing serious actions and strategies. For example, China recently announced their 2060 net zero goals. Our own companies in Singapore, many of them have already started counting, measuring their carbon footprint, and then coming up with very ambitious climate goals as well. I think ultimately it's not any one particular segment of society that is responsible or has to act. I think it's an interplay between the public, the private, and the people sectors coming together to understand the different priorities of society, understanding the trade-offs between these priorities, and then co-creating solutions to address climate change as an existential crisis.
I personally feel that governments and corporations do hold more responsibility as compared to just individual consumers, just because they have so much more power and influence to really shift things. And I would also say that because climate change impacts people disproportionately, different people contribute to it differently as well. So like the richest, like 1% of the world, for example, they would definitely contribute a lot more than just like people from lower income groups. And I think it's very important to take that into account when we're considering climate solutions.
Thank you for raising that, because one of the things that really is quite important to discuss is being able to address climate issues a privilege. Is it something that only wealthier countries can do? Seeing as how this is a global and a collective problem, what can we do to make sure everybody comes out of it together?
Can we hold emerging markets to the Western ideals that you can't produce carbon, you're not allowed to cut down your forests, you're not allowed to fish in your seas? What has changed, in my view, is globalization has changed a lot. With trade, of the way the world's trade systems work, has everyone benefited from it uniformly? No, they haven't. Do we still see poverty today? Yes, we do. We talk about energy systems, we talk about the energy mix. Is coal still required? Maybe not in the West, but certainly in countries such as Bangladesh, which is one of the most climate prone or vulnerable countries in the world, and the Philippines as well, for example. So what we need to do, in my view, is for emerging markets, we need to make sure that the right level of capital is available to help finance the right projects in that direction, whether it be green, whether it be into transition. They're not going to transition overnight, so it's going to take time. But we need to make sure that the capital is there and people are aware and they have the ability to sustainably develop and grow.
When you really think about it, going back to this idea of privilege, right? It seems as though a lot of sustainable alternatives that are available to an individual consumer in the market are a little bit more expensive. They're costly. And maybe Kate, in your experience, because you talk to businesses about trying to make a transition to offer more sustainable alternatives, have you experienced any pushback, and what have you observed in this space?
I think that individual action, a lot of it should be made more accessible to people, or more responsibility should be given to those who are in a position of financial privilege to be able to do it. So for example, when we think of very simple eco products, like even just a metal straw, is more expensive than a usual plastic straw, and you can't expect everybody to be able to make that switch. Yeah, so it's definitely something that we have to take into account. But since we're on this topic of individual and collective action, I actually wanted to direct a question to Roger. Can I? So there's been a lot of talk about how even as individuals, we can shift systems. So for example, writing to your local politicians or writing to a bank to explain, I'm deciding to shift to another bank because you are investing in fossil fuels. I just wanted to ask, as a young person, how effective is that actually when we try and make that change?
That's a really good question. And again, it plays back into the question on the media as well. If you were to ask that question 10 years ago, we'd probably say, well, not that effective. But today, I believe it is a lot more effective, given that you have the media, you have social media behind you, that your decision can be broadcast to millions of people in just one tweet, for example. And so the power of social media and the power of the decisions that you make are exponentially more powerful, given that you have so many more tools today, and the decisions that you make can influence others at a much greater rate than they did before.
Everything kind of falls back into this entire idea of how there's different stakeholders within an economy. But when you really think about it, we're talking about climate, we're talking about environment, we're talking about preserving nature. Those things, can we really distill them always into monetary value? And should this conversation always be geared back to economics and money?
I think it's not just money as a currency, but also convenience, happiness, sometimes also weighing against time, and whether you're trading off time versus other priorities and so on. So that's why I think it's a very complicated issue. What we do as individuals, in a way, is a microcosm of what society decides to do also, right? It's the same issue of having to balance different conflicting priorities.
We should be talking about rejuvenative industries as opposed to sustainability, where we're just going to sustain what we're doing, status quo, as opposed to we need to put back in more than we take out and allow this to rejuvenate. When we go to a poor coastal community, they will say, hey, I got to put food on the table. I got to have my lights on and electricity for my kids. I got to have internet. I mean, you tell me about cleaning my environment and not polluting the ocean. Please explain to me how I have to pay for waste removal. How do we solve for that? But how do we also then, find solutions that can rejuvenate those environments or those communities?
A lot of conversations now around climate change are still centered on things like technology, money, markets. And I do think those are important, but at the same time, it's going to take a much larger cultural and mindset change. I think moving away from a scarcity mindset to one that really celebrates collaboration, generosity, and that's going to take a much longer time, I think, to get everybody on board. But it's something that needs to be done.
What is our measure of success?
Yeah.
In most markets, for most people, in most jobs, it's money. GDP is the measure that we use to measure growth of economies. This is an economic measure that talks about growth. Is that appropriate? Does that take into account how that growth is achieved? Is it by, for example, reducing nature or polluting more? Those are the kinds of very simple changes in thinking that we can put in place in order to change that mindset.
So it seems that a lot of this manner of thinking is very rooted in capitalist theory. And from a bank perspective, should we maybe be ready to push for more radical change in terms of our economic thinking? Should we be coming up with new theories to sort of encapsulate this problem in the 21st century? So for instance, in Amsterdam recently, they have been experimenting with donut economics. So it's basically finding this sweet spot for economic growth that is between sort of a social foundation and an environmental ceiling. And you kind of want to be in that nice little middle between the two. But are our economies ready for that sort of thinking?
I think climate change has definitely shown us where our boundaries lie. We know we need to be at a 1.5 degree world, yet we're still on a trajectory of over 3 degrees. So we know we're missing the target at today. But we do know where the boundaries are. And I think by setting these boundaries, it helps. It's going to take time, but we will learn to live within these boundaries. I think something that resonates from what everyone said today is very much around the circular economy. And I think we need to, and I said it in the beginning, we need a fundamental shift in our economic system, the way that, and our cultural behaviors, everything from top all the way down in how we look at the resources on this planet. Everything is finite, and we need to manage that. And we need to manage that within these limits. The concept of the circular economy is out there. It doesn't fit with this current economic model. We need to fundamentally change that. We need to look at waste as a resource.
If you look at alternative foods, alternative meats, alternative seafood, and where that market is moving financially, every VC is moving in that direction. Mushrooms, you can create leather out of mushrooms now. I mean, again, when I talk about these capitalist systems, this is about how you hack that and turn that into a mechanism for good. You could create products, you could create services, you could create markets that completely change the way that we lived before, the way we ate, the way we go to work, the way we dress, everything.
So a lot of what you have shared so far, it speaks to the fact that people are becoming more conscious of this problem. The awareness is definitely there. But how do we tip that awareness into action?
I think collective action is critical, as well as taking an individual responsibility. So governments need to do their part. They need to figure out what they can do. Individuals need to do this. Corporations, financial institutions, but we also need to work together. Because really by working together, NGOs, financial institutions, governments, that's where we can really amplify the effect. And that's really where we can have a real difference.
I think that's always the most difficult question about how to shift from awareness to action. I would completely agree that it's really just about getting down to doing it, and like even just in conversations with friends and family, like just opening up these conversations and getting people to just start making small changes and easing them into it.
Sometimes I imagine that I'm the Anthony Fauci of the environmental community. In that I'm not partisan, or I'm not really advocate for any particular position, but rather as a scientist, I think our role is to provide the evidence base, the facts and figures, so that policymakers and decision makers in the public and private sectors are able to make more informed decisions.
So we're going to close with the quick-fire questions again. Since we've been talking about money, economy, let's place some bets. Where do you think we'll be in 2050?
The one thing I do know in 2050 is we will have the means, and we would have deployed the means to change society. I think we need to change our attitudes, our behaviors. I think that being more conscious around the world that we live in will become the new norm.
I'm optimistic that we will be able to achieve what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has set out for us to do, which is to achieve net zero emissions by around that time, mid-century, 2050, 2060. And moving on from mid-century, I think we will begin to remove the legacy CO2 and greenhouse gases that we have released into the atmosphere, and essentially go into reverse gear, bringing back the more benign and pre-industrial climate that would be much more livable for everyone.
I think in 2050, sustainability will be a lot more mainstream, ingrained in our culture. So people will be a lot more conscious about the way they consume and live. And my personal hope is also for Singapore to be closer to net zero emissions.
I'll be 68 in 2050, which means that a lot of my life's work should have been achieved by then. Seaweed, mussels, plastic to fuel, and many other innovations. By the time I've turned 68, the world will be redone and rewritten in a very interesting way, and hopefully for the better.
I think in 2050 we will be celebrating victory over climate change, because to me the alternative is just unthinkable.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.